Hey, so in this portion of the video series, we're going to be looking at how to use the tools from our modeling toolkit. So I'll be using this Paul Kingma coffee table created using Roki's art style as a demo. But just as a reminder, these videos aren't really going to be step-by-step tutorials, but rather an indication of how to use tools in Maya for your own projects. So I'll be using a lot of the tools mostly from the modeling toolkit, which is over here on the right-hand side. And if it's not from there, then they're probably going to be used from the shortcuts over here on the poly modeling shelf tab. However, what I will do is on the video I'll overlay some text so you can see where in the menus up here these tools can be located. Okay, so here you have the model of what the final outcome is going to look like. But because you guys are going to be learning how to work with materials a little bit later down this pipeline, I'm going to turn on my wireframe mode just so we can see the geometry a little better. And I'm also going to turn off any materials just so you can see the baseline models and how they're kind of formed using shapes. So the first things we're going to be looking into is in our modeling toolkit how to use the smooth tool and the bevel tool to get some of these kind of more distinctive shapes. So you can see on the corner of this table there's a lot of kind of very angular bevels where it's got these kind of sharp edges, whereas on like the bottom of the table here you've got more rounded edges. So that's done using bevels. We're also going to be looking at how to use smooth tool to get some of the shapes like this a little more curved. What you'll notice when looking at some of the artwork in Roki, particularly the characters, is that a lot of the body parts and a lot of kind of props and stuff in the game as well are made by using something called a soft cube to begin with. So I'll show you how to set that up. Okay, so what I have here as an example is I've just got like a standard primitive cube and a standard sphere here as well. So they've just been added in using the polymodeling shelf up here. So if you click one of these, this will appear on the viewport. So what we're going to use is the smooth tool on this cube. So I'm going to select that and go to smooth, and you'll see that makes a very kind of low poly sphere-like shape. Now the reason why that's better from using just a standard low poly sphere, so if I click on the sphere and go to my channel modeling, my channel box up here and go to inputs, I can change this to be lower poly, so I can say like 6 by 6 for example. If I can type that, there you go. And you can see it's slightly lower poly. Now the problem with this is whenever you use a sphere you have this kind of pinching happening on the top and the bottom where you've got all of these triangles, and that can be quite difficult sometimes to shape and maneuver and to make that more subtle. Whereas when you have a soft cube like this, you can use beveling tools to actually help you elongate some of these axes. So if I double click on those edges and use my bevel tool, so just here it says bevel, you can also use Control B as a shortcut for that as well. Then what this means is I can very easily select vertices and move these up. A lot of the limbs you'll see in characters and stuff in Roki are made using this tactic, but there will be a separate video for that. But you can kind of see how it's a lot easier to maneuver these shapes, right? Whereas if I was going to do that on my circle, if I was going to, for example, take this middle line and try to bevel that, then you've got this kind of weird geometry happening up here, and there's always going to be some slight pinching. You've got n-gons happening and forming, so it's just easier to use a soft cube from the beginning. Now, the way that, if I delete these, the way that we use that to make that lamp, so if I get this model back up, you can see here that's essentially just a higher division of a soft cube there. So if I was to bring in a cube and let's move that up, so I'm hitting W to move that up, making that slightly larger just so we can see it as a comparison side by side, and I'll hit F to frame that. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit smooth. I might do more than one division when I smooth this just to get a slightly more curved shape, so I'm going to try 2. I think that'll be enough. And then what I can do now is I can go to my vertices, and to be honest, like I kind of want to bevel this line first. The reason for that is when I select half the object, I would quite like to have half of it and not just the top section here, right? So if I had this line and beveled it, that would create more geometry. It would split that line to 2, and you can see fraction here is going to make that closer together, and so on. So I could do something like this, and that way if I was to now go to vertex mode, you can see that is actually half of the shape, right? So I can move that up like this. If I wanted to stretch that out again, I could bevel this middle edge just so I have more geometry to work with here. And then using vertex, I can select that, hit W, and I can move that across. And you can see I have something quite similar to this lamp shape. Not exactly, but you know, if I added a bevel even on this edge here, so I'm doing Control B as the shortcut there just to bevel it, then you can see I can select half of that object, and just move that over, and that's more of a similar shape to what I've got here. So bevels can actually be used in a number of different ways in Maya. So we used it just there for that lamp to add geometry, just so it's easy to manipulate the 3D model. But you can have angular bevels in a model. You can see here on the tables we've got that. You can have smooth bevels where we've got the bottom of this table formed. You can use it for edge detail. Like for example, you can see we've got some gaps in between where these tiles are. If I turn on my materials, you can kind of see how that's used in that sense. And I'll just turn that back off for you. You can also use it to add geometry like we just did, and also depth. So angles for your bevel don't always have to be coming out like this. They can be inverted. So we're going to go through each of those step by step. So in order to do that, what I've done is I've pre-prepared just here in my outliner how this table began. And like most objects, it's usually just a cube, right? So you have one cube and another cube. They're not extruded from one another or anything like that. They're just kind of sitting on top of each other as separate objects. So we'll use this top cube first to begin with. So I have that selected, and I'm going to go to my modeling toolkit and hit Bevel. Now, if I was to do that, what that's going to do is it's going to bevel every single edge of that model. We don't want that, and that can cause a lot of issues. For example, you can get a lot of n-gons. It's difficult to manage, so I'm going to Control Z that. And what you're going to want to make sure that you're doing is you want to make sure you're selecting the specific edges. So I'm right clicking here and going to edge mode to do that. And if I hold shift, I can select more than one edge. Okay, so I'm holding shift and just clicking all of these edges on the corners. So you can see anything that's red here is selected. And then what I'm going to do now is hit bevel. And you can see I get that kind of angular look to it. Now what this is telling me is the fraction is how big I want this angle to be. What you can find is when you click and drag over this text, that's adjustable. However, you might find that the increments are a little bit too high. If you want to have some smaller increments that you can kind of play around with there, so it's not so much jumping from one number to another. You can see it's going from like 0.3 to 0.4 to 0.6 and so on. You can hold control when you're moving this. So I'm holding control, clicking on fraction and moving that, and you can see I'm getting some smaller increments there, and you can be a little bit more precise with how much you want these angles to be. So I'm going to say something like this is similar to what we had. The segments here are talking about how many lines you would like to fill that gap in. So you can see here the more segments I add, the kind of softer that curve becomes. I don't want that for this example because I want this general shape, so I want one segment. Now you can kind of see if I toggle between this version of the mesh and that kind of final outcome we had, how that's going to translate to that shape later on. Okay, so we kind of have that baseline angle of a bevel in there. Now something to watch out for is when you bevel, you do get n-gons. So you can see this here is a big kind of shape that's definitely more than 4 sides, right? So that's something we'll come to later on how to fix that. But for now, we're just kind of getting the base forms there using the bevels. But do keep in mind, if you're using beveling tools, you will get n-gons and you'll have to manually fix those, okay? Now what we can do is you can see here we have these angles done. However, on this bottom section here, we have more of a soft curve there, right? So we're going to try and replicate that. So let me go back to this version of the shape. I'm going to click this bottom section, and again, just using the edge tool, we're going to select just those edges on the corner there, because we don't want to bevel the entire thing. With that in mind, we're going to click bevel up here, or again you can use Control B. Now this is an example where we don't want a bevel that's so angular here, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually add more segments to this. I think maybe 3 segments is a little bit better, and you can see how you have that kind of smoother curve there. Now if I was to adjust the fraction, you can see how, maybe this view is a little bit better to show that. You can see if I adjust the fraction, I'll make that more curved because it's kind of spacing them out a little bit more. But I don't want them too much. You know, I think something like that is fine. That's the kind of shape we want to go for. Something to keep in mind as well is if you do play around with the fraction and you get it so that these edges kind of meet in the middle, you will have double vertices here. So you just want to keep out for that. We'll have a video later on how to kind of merge those a little bit, but just keep that in mind if you're using bevel a little bit too much. So shape like this will work well. Again, if I go from this shape to the final outcome that we have and just toggle that on and off, you can see I've actually made the bevel a little bit more curved on that other one. So let's just play around with that. Let's increase that fraction a little bit. I might use control just to have a slightly better increment there. And then let's try that now. So let's toggle between. There you go. That's quite similar there, right? So you can kind of see how that translates. And we've used bevels to make the shape for the table here. Okay, so far what we've kind of looked at is over with this lamp example we had here, we were using the bevel tool to add geometry. We've also been using the beveling tool to add these more angular bevels here and softer bevels like we've got on the bottom here just to have more smooth or like smoother geometry. If I toggle back to the example that we're following with, so let me do that. If anyone's interested, the way that I'm toggling between objects in my outliner is I'm just hitting H, that hides and unhides objects. But you can see here that an issue we have with this version of the model is we can't really tell what is a tile. Like I've just pre-prepared this tabletop here for us to work with, but you can see there's not really any grouting around these. It's difficult to tell where these tiles start or what type of material this is made from at all. So I've turned off my materials and I've turned on wireframe just to make this a little bit easier to see. But what we're going to do is we're going to go to edge selection mode, and I'm just going to select all of the edges of this kind of tabletop that I want to add grouting to. So let's just go through and click all of those. And then what you'll see is we'll be using the beveling tool just to add geometry in between to get that edge detail, which we can then colour with a material later down the pipeline. That'll be shown in a different video how to do that. But okay, so I have all of these edges selected, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to bevel, or Control B is the shortcut, and you can see this as like a consistent line across everything. Now this line is huge compared to what we want, right? So I'm going to hold Control just to get smaller increments, and I'm going to click on this fraction button and just drag that to the left, and you can see I get a smaller increment there. And I'll say something like that is about what we're looking for. Now, as you know, this model still has things like n-gons, which we'll be fixing later down the line, but in terms of getting the edge detail that we want and the shapes that we want generally, we have that set up using the bevel tool. I also have another example just here of this kind of old cabinet, just to show how beveling can be used in terms of depth as well. So you can see here we have these kind of inlays, this shape here where you have this kind of curved area, but you also have this area here where you have an inverted bevel. So this is what I mean about when you play with depth. Bevels don't always have to be rounded in that way. It can be an inverted bevel like this. So just to kind of make this clearer to see, again, I'm going to just turn off my materials. I'm going to turn on wireframe, and I have some pre-prepared cubes here that are just kind of scaled accordingly to show you how this would be done. So to get that kind of edge that we've got here to be curved, it would be the same thing we did for the table. I would select those kind of corner edges and just go to bevel. And you can see here we want something that's a little bit higher poly than what we had for that table. So we're going to have more segments. We're going to make that fraction go all of the way just to kind of get this shape going. Now again, we have this issue here where because the fraction meets in the middle, you do have two vertices here. So you can see if I zoom in and just click and drag over this area, Maya's telling me I have two vertices selected up here. A way that you can fix that when using beveling is you can go to Edit Mesh, Merge, and what that will do is anything which is in the distance of 0.01, it will merge those two vertices together. So I also want to do that on the back one there as well. If you have a lot of things up at once, then what you can do is go to Isolate mode. So I'm going to select just that object, and there's a little button up here. It's a little kind of blue square with a arrow on it, and if I was to click that, I can just see this object, which is a little bit easier to see. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select these vertices here. That also says there's two selected, and I'm going to go to Edit Mesh, Merge to Center. Same down here because I know that's going to have a similar issue. So these two here, a good kind of shortcut is this area here will show you the last tool that you've used. So this is going to say, for me, it's well, it's saying it's the manipulator tool, but I know that it was merge to center. So if I was to select these and hit G as the shortcut, that will repeat that tool. So that's turned that 2 into a 1. So if I do that there as well, hit G, that's turned that 2 into 1. That's merged those two vertices together. And if I want to see the whole object again, then what I can do is just click that isolate mode button just up here again, and I can see everything. Okay, so this has given me that shape. Now, what I've done to get this as it is I just deleted all of this really, so that it was just this middle face that I have. Again, I think I'm going to go to vertex mode, sorry, isolate mode just to show this. There we go, just so you can see I've got that one face. And then what I did from there is with the edge entirely selected, I extruded that out a little bit from that bevel. So extrude is just here in your component editor. I'll be going through extruding a little bit more depth later down the line, but I just added some, not thickness, but an offset to that, just to kind of get that shape with maybe like 2 division or something like that. But that's roughly how I made this initial shape, right? And I think I even used maybe bevel to add a bit of geometry on that middle line there, and select this edge loop. The way I did that, by the way, is if you select one face and then double click the one next to it, it will select the entire edge loop of that face. Same goes for edge mode and things like that. But I can now move that out a little bit. And you can see I have a shape that's pretty similar to this one here. But to get this area here, it would be the same kind of premise there. So for example, I'm going to select those corners. Here we go. I'm going to go to bevel mode. So just bevel here, bevel tool. Same thing again. I'm going to like add more segments and stuff and, you know, bring that fraction in. But instead, I'm going to play around with this little section here saying depth. Now, the more depth you have, the more curved that's going to be, but if you decrease that depth, you can see that starts to kind of cave in on itself. And if you follow the same pipeline of what I did here, where you kind of let's get in isolation mode just to show you. You know, if I just wanted that front face here, I could do the same thing where I select that edge, extrude that out a little bit, add some offset with maybe like a division inside it, delete that middle face, double click that edge in the middle to get the edge loop, bevel that, and then, you know, I can double click this and just move that out and get that kind of shape that I was working with there. But that's how you can use bevel to get a lot of these kind of interesting shapes that we've been working with here. Obviously this would need moving. I could cut this in half just to have that top bit, which is how I got the shape for the top and the bottom.